Happy New Year and welcome back to Just One Q, the podcast where we explore the latest ideas in workplace diversity, equity, and inclusion in conversation with thought leaders and DEI experts. Each episode, I ask our guests one key question and a bunch of follow-up questions, highlighting their area of expertise in DEI. The goal is to leave you with the tools and insights that you need to drive change in your own life, both personally and professionally. I'm your host, Dominique. I'm a DEI educator and advocate working for Dialectic, an inclusive workplace learning consultancy in lovely Guelph, Ontario. And on this week's episode, I have the pleasure of speaking with Elaine Lin Hering. Welcome to the show, Elaine.
Thanks for having me.
Elaine is a facilitator, author, and speaker, and she works with organizations and individuals to build skills in communication, collaboration, and conflict management. She has worked on 6 continents and facilitated executive education at Harvard, Dartmouth, Tufts, UC Berkeley, and UCLA. She is the former advanced training director for the Harvard Mediation Program and a lecturer on law at Harvard Law School. She has worked with coal miners at BHP Billiton, microfinance organizers in East Africa, mental health professionals in China, and senior leadership at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Her clients include American Express, Chevron, Google, Nike, Novartis, PayPal, Pixar, and the Red Cross. And she is also the author of the forthcoming book, Unlearning Silence: How to Speak Your Mind, Unleash Talent, and Live More Fully, published by Penguin. Elaine, I am very excited to have you on the show to talk today, and particularly to talk about this idea of unlearning silence.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. So specifically, the question that we're going to aim to answer together today is very much related to your book, and that is, what are the impacts of silence and how can we unlearn it? So your work is all about, unlearning silence and speaking up. And before diving into your work, I have to admit that my own personal biases, and this could be introversion, maybe sensory preferences, or even my own cultural baggage, led me to think of silence as mostly good. A break from the loud, fast-paced, attention-seeking culture in which, noise making is often rewarded over careful thought. So as a first step, I want to get specific here and define what kind of silence you're talking about, whose silence we're talking about, and how is it damaging to organizations and society more broadly?
Yeah. As someone trained as a lawyer, I'm delighted that you're starting by let's define our terms. So let's do that, because I completely agree with you. We actually need more spaciousness, more quietness. We need deep states of flow, and all of that comes with silence. So when I talk about the silence that we need to unlearn, I'm not talking about that silence. The silence I'm talking about is having to edit out parts of yourself, having to withhold your thoughts, ideas, inputs, characteristics, identities, because they're not welcome on your team, in your workplace, or your community. It is both a verb of being silenced, right? When you shared your thoughts, you were met with defensiveness. You were told as a child, maybe, that children are to be seen and not heard.
Oh, yeah.
In the workplace, as a more junior person, right? Just do the job. Don't add to the noise. Or even sometimes you're just met with literal silence, the noun, which is you're sitting in a meeting, you work up the courage to offer your thought, and then the conversation moves on as if no one even heard you or you didn't say anything. And you're sitting there being like, did I say that out loud? Because you all sure acting as if nothing happened. And the reason that that's particularly important is that experience of being silenced or met with silence, where you have to withhold yourself or you're not welcome, your thoughts, ideas, way of existing are not welcome, disproportionately impacts the people who carry subordinated identities. So women, people of color, based on ability, class, education, you name it.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're already more likely to be othered, and then you constantly get these messages that you're not welcome. And if you're going to stay here, you've got to conform.
Mm-hmm.
So that silencing is having to edit out parts of yourself. And the reason it's particularly important is because our lives are all interconnected. So as someone who's been in leadership development for more than a decade, my observation is there are so many well-intentioned leaders in our workplaces who aspire and intend to be inclusive. And yet, when you do diagnostic calls with their direct reports say, like, there's no way I'd ever really say what I think to them.
Right.
And that disconnect is mind boggling, but also makes sense from the perspective of leaders unintentionally silencing the very people they claim to support.
That's a very powerful idea. I mean, I love that you're framing this in an intersectional way. And I
Mm,
love that you're talking about silence through the lens of these subordinated identities.
mhm,
Because I think anyone with any kind of, marginalized or subordinated identity has experienced this pretty much daily and forever.
yeah.
I mean, I'm certainly tempted to think of the ways that I've been silenced myself.
Mhm,
And I am a white and straight passing person. And I
mm,
have had enough privilege to unsilence myself or to voice my opinions over a lifetime and
mhm,
probably to get louder and louder as I get older and
mm,
bolder. Um,
mm,
but I want to recognize out loud as we're getting started here that it's not a right that others necessarily have. So I really do appreciate that you're bringing that lens to this. And it is very different from, that beneficial silence. We're talking
mhm.
about silencing identities, silencing ways of being, silencing stories or perspectives for the sake of fitting in or, yeah, being within
Yeah.
that mold. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you raised the question of why does it matter? Imagine, there's some folks who are like, well, so what?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you can't have belonging in a workplace. You can't honor someone's dignity. We can't move toward further on the arc toward justice if we are actually silencing people. Or to exist in a context, we have to silence ourselves. And so when we talk about employee engagement, when we talk about
Mm-hmm.
innovation, when we talk about collaboration, you can't have psychological safety if you feel silenced by leaders around you. So when I look at a lot of these workplace challenges, quote unquote, silence actually underpins them. And so
Mm.
at some level, we've been solving for the symptoms, but not for the root cause.
Yeah. Oh,
And as
wow.
someone who has been teaching people skills in negotiation, how to have difficult conversations, how to give and receive feedback, companies invest so much in skills training.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, my observation from having taught the frameworks and at the Harvard Negotiation Project is yes, these frameworks and tools are useful.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're not examining the underlying layer, we're only going to get so far. And the underlying layer came from this observation of, well, yeah, these are useful skills, but why do some people still don't have the difficult conversations? Why don't you give and receive feedback even though HR is telling you you should and you know you should and intellectually you agree?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because we've all learned silence. And so often in our lives and in our workplaces, we are rewarded for staying silent because you don't want to rock the boat. You don't want to be the tall poppy for the Australians listening.
Yeah.
Right? You don't want to go against the grain, particularly if conformity is what is rewarded in the workplace. So we really need to wrestle with in what ways have I learned silence? And because we act out of habit and instinct in this really fast paced world that we're in what ways am I silencing myself and I don't even realize it?
Mm.
And how do our policies and practices in the workplace in particular reward that?
Yeah.
Because none of us really want to dip our toe into the water to say, let me find out what really happens when I offer a dissenting opinion. Instead, we're watching for what our colleagues do, the long timers, our managers. And if that's not what they do, I guess the message we internalize so often is, I guess we just don't do that around here.
Hmm. Yes. So you're answering this question of how is it damaging to organizations so beautifully and eloquently. And I think the big reveal in this for me and what you're saying is that the silence is that kind of more foundational piece
Mhm.
or the root cause of all of the lack of psychological safety, the lack of difficult conversation skills, all of these things that I actually write training for and deliver
Mm.
all the time.
Mhm.
And so, we do often talk about it being just a skill. If you have these soft skills, then you're going to just encourage or create a climate in which silence is broken, perhaps.
Mhm.
But what you're saying is that there's maybe a more personal unlearning that has to happen as well or concurrently. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, I would say that it's most powerful when we excavate, right? If
Mm,
you want to have a strong foundation, let's actually understand and wrestle with what is our own relationship with silence, in part so we can actually make intentional decisions going forward.
yeah.
And that is the difference between reactive decision making and intentional decision making, right? And we need both. Reactive decision making is that subconscious piece that I shouldn't have to intentionally think about how to tie my shoe. I actually don't
Right.
know if anyone still wears shoes with laces, but we'll go with that analogy. But that intentional decision making is thinking, what biases might I hold here?
Hmm.
What lenses am I using to view the world? Am I doing just what I've seen other people do, or am I doing what I think is right and
Hmm.
good and just? And let me be clear, the difficult conversation skills training, the feedback skills training, all of that is still useful. I think it's complementary to this work. But instead of just saying, let's add on and layer on, I want to look at the foundation to say, what are we building on? And if what we're building on is not what we intend or need, let's excavate. That's the unlearning.
Yeah.
The unlearning isn't just a, catchy phrase or trying to come up with a different spin on things. It's really looking at, we've all internalized different messages throughout our lifetime. As
Yeah.
adults, which do we want to keep? Which still serve us and the people we want to be, and which might we need to let go of.
And that's a great segue into kind of in this next question, which is how did we get here?
Mm.
What are the key ways that we learn silence or are silenced? And you've already kind of hinted at some of them, but I wonder if we can go a little bit deeper here because I want to see what this excavation looks like and how far back you have to go.
Well, I am of the mindset that however well intentioned the grown-ups in your life might be as you're growing up, as adults ourselves, we spend time figuring out what we want to keep and what we need to let go of. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes there's a therapy fund that needs to be created along the way. Let's take myself as an example. I am a Taiwan-born Asian American. And I choose that wording really carefully because I'm in my own process of, I used to say I'm Chinese American, but was born in Taipei. And people would say, well, no, then you're Taiwanese. And I'm like, but
Right.
I, I don't know where to fit in this geopolitical
Yeah.
challenge and
Yep.
dynamic that is way bigger than I am. So I was born in Taiwan. I can stand behind that. I identify as Asian American. I can stand behind that. I'm also the youngest daughter in my Asian American family that has a backdrop of patriarchy, if we go back centuries and centuries in Chinese culture. And so, by nature of that, I grew up with the messages of to respect your elders means to not push back.
Mm-hmm.
Don't express a difference of opinion. They know more than you do. So, therefore, you show deference. Deference equals respect.
Mm-hmm.
I am also identify as female against a backdrop of patriarchy. So by nature, I am second chair to any situation. And so all of that points me toward silence, toward deference, to even questioning whether I have a voice, because that in many frames, I exist, or the identities I carry exist. People with the identities I carry exist to be of service, to others. And so it begs the question of, do I even have a voice of my own, or am I just here to do other people's bidding, to put it really
Mm.
frankly?
Mm-hmm.
And for those of us who work in organizations at the more junior level, often that is the expectation. You're being groomed, quote unquote,
Isn't that a
as if you
terrible
are a,
word?
oh yeah.
Oh
And yet how
man.
often is it used?
Yeah. Groomed for a role.
Groomed for a role. What does that even mean? And
Mm.
groomed as if you're a blank canvas,
Mm-hmm.
as if you don't, as a human being, come with a lifetime of experiences and identities and values of your own. So, how deep does the unlearning go? However deep you're willing to go.
Right.
And one of the really hard things about this is it's not just silence isn't just learned in the workplace,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's like that dinner with that uncle of yours when you were 6, but we don't
Yep.
really talk about that in the workplace. That's quote unquote too personal.
Right.
But because who we are as people doesn't have a dividing line between work and personal life, when I'm having these conversations in work contexts and amongst work teams, my stance is I will go wherever you want to go,
Mm.
but to let you have the agency of defining how deep you want to go with your colleagues, because you know that better than I do.
Oh boy. Yeah.
I've also been amazed, though, right? When we
Yeah.
talk about actually understanding each other as colleagues, seeing each other for humanity rather than utility, you're not just the salesperson. You're not just the IT person who makes my email work. Hopefully, I see you as more than that.
Yes.
But you're the person telling me a story about when you were 8, you went to McDonald's for the first time in your life, because we're American,
Oh, we have
first
it
time in
here
your
too.
life,
Mm-hmm.
because you saved up money because your family didn't have the money. So you were really excited to get like the French fries that you see in the commercials
Yeah.
that are piping hot and crisp and the right amount of salt. And when your order came, the French fries were cold. And you negotiated with yourself as to whether you should ask the McDonald's employee for a hot order,
Mm-hmm.
knowing that you probably wouldn't have these French fries for another year until you saved it. Right. But do you ask? Do you say, these French fries are cold? Can I have some hot ones?
Yeah.
And I mean, that's a live conversation that I've had the privilege of facilitating, and people who don't have those experiences, who never wondered whether they would be able to afford McDonald's French fries, saying, wow, I've never had that life experience. I
Yeah.
wouldn't have thought of that, but how deeply that shapes whether we ask for raises,
Yeah.
whether we assume that we can, quote unquote, take up space in a meeting. And of course, that's paired with how people's reactions to us either reinforce or disrupt the mindset we already have, right? You're in a meeting, you finally say something, the conversation moves on as if you didn't say anything.
Yeah.
How does that reinforce the patterns that we already have and the learning that we have, or have the incredible opportunity to disrupt it?
But those moments can be so powerful, right? If they finally go well.
So powerful, completely disorienting, but it also says to me, each of us, regardless of what role we hold within an organization, actually have the power to do that.
Mm.
We can talk about co-conspiratorship, we can talk about allyship, but in those moments to say, hold on, I want to go back to what Dominique just said, because I think it's a valuable point or an interesting point, something that says, I see you, I
Mm.
heard you, you are of value. Is that not what we each need as human beings?
Absolutely. That's such a powerful form of advocacy in that moment and allyship. And yeah,
And to
what
do
a,
that for each other,
yeah.
right? It is risky, but this also gets us out of the dynamic that I so often hear about, which is, I'm going to commiserate with you in private of, oh my
Right.
gosh, I can't believe Jim did that to you.
Yep.
But where are you publicly? Where were you in
Mm,
that meeting when the conversation just moved on? And can we do that for each other? Can we, and let me be clear, it's a big ask in some levels to say, I'm going to use my social capital to disrupt this existing dynamic, to bring to light and give light to someone else whose ideas I think are of value. And if we're all doing that, it is fundamentally a different work dynamic.
absolutely. It would have to be. But it's also such a simple thing. It
Mhm,
sounds like, like it might take a little bit of bravery, but for
mhm,
somebody who has that social capital, it's no big deal, right? So
mhm,
I think this is the power of your message too, is just bringing awareness to those people that they are the ones who have that social capital and for whom it should be
mhm,
easy to change things or to disrupt these patterns.
mhm,
I want to ask you, I mean, I know a lot of organizations and a lot of leaders have, imperfections
mhm,
when it comes to difficult conversations or, creating psychological safety and all of these things that we know makes organizations healthy.
mhm,
But I would say that most organizations that I deal with, even ones that aren't even particularly progressive, tend to position themselves as highly consultative, very
mhm,
transparent, employee driven,
mhm,
community centered, or even kind of democratic.
mhm,
These are the ideals that people like to say that they are espousing.
mhm,
So, what kinds of organizational cultures enforce silence?
mhm,
And are there any tells that we should be kind of looking out for in that organizational context?
mhm. I love that question because my challenge to organizations, and organizations are impersonal, so to leaders who run organizations, is get really honest about who you actually are. There is such pressure, particularly in the last years, to be inclusive, to be, democratic and employee driven. And the biggest friction point I've seen is actually the lack of integrity between what you say you are and how you show up.
Yeah, yeah.
If you actually are a command and control environment, to me, that's okay, so long as you admit it.
Mm,
The friction point is when you say you value humanity, you value differences of opinion, but how leaders act and how your policies are crafted and enforced don't actually support that environment.
hmm.
So you end up in this catch-22 of someone walking to an environment thinking it's going to be something because they've read the values on the website that are professed, but those values are empty and everyone knows it.
Hmm.
Versus let's be really candid and honest and have integrity about the culture we're building. And there are trade-offs to all of this, right? If you want to go fast, if you're innovating, if you are failing quickly,
Yeah.
that's a different environment and that's okay. But let people know what they're walking into and let people know what's really valued so that there's alignment with what you profess and what you do. Because the psychological safety comes from, is my experience aligned with the expectations that were set?
Right.
And those expectations can be set of, look, we're actually not interested in differences of opinion here. We're just trying to produce. And if I know that, then people can self-select into the environments that make sense and the context that they make sense for them, rather than finding out the hard way and getting burned. Because the
Right.
part that we don't talk about is the trauma and the detoxing and the pain and the healing that is a long tail from any toxic work environment that also, by the way, refuses to see itself as such because our values say something else. If I may, I'm also going to take it to the micro level, which is as a leader, being really clear about what you're asking for input on,
Hmm.
being really clear about who actually makes the decision, and that it is okay where there are some things where you just inform your team and you're not consulting or joint decision makers. And this is the three buckets framework that's in my book. There's lots of different variations in terms of RACI, but let's get clear about who's deciding what role we play and You cannot run businesses on consensus of
Yeah.
5,000 people. So
That was that was my first thought too, is like at the, this bigger lesson that you're saying, it can also boil down to those individual moments
yes.
where maybe your conflict management approach isn't specifically collaborative,
Mhm.
because collaboration and extreme levels of consultation would just not be appropriate for the problem that you're trying to solve.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, but communicating that is really important,
Yeah.
and choosing those less collaborative paths. I think you can do it gracefully, but it does take an articulation of what your intention is, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And letting your intention actually map up with the action versus saying your intention is to be consultative or interest based,
Right.
but then your actions are directive
Mm-hmm.
and positional.
Mm.
It's that disconnect that leaves people untethered and not knowing what to trust in the system.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a great takeaway for people, for our listeners, to just sort of evaluate whether there's a gap between sort of these professed ways of being and how it actually plays out in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to dive into that a little bit more. In your forthcoming book, you go way beyond obviously just defining this problem, and you talk about how we can unlearn it, first as individuals and also as leaders and as organizations. So I'd love to talk about this unlearning in two parts.
Mm-hmm.
First, how can we begin to speak up if we
Mm-hmm.
identify as someone who has learned silence? What are
Mm-hmm.
those first baby steps?
Mm-hmm.
How do you move yourself from somebody who identifies as having been silenced to somebody who is emboldened to
Yeah.
speak up?
Yeah.
And I guess the second part is, how can we unlearn this habit of silencing others? And we've touched on a couple of those ideas already, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about both of those aspects.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's start with ourselves and how we unlearn. The reason that the book is called Unlearning Silence is because it is an ongoing process. So, ing, it's not a once and done. So, even that mindset is important, not just from a double loop learning standpoint, but this is an ongoing journey that we're all on, and we're going to fall back into different habits. And the unlearning comes from continuing to make conscious choices in our actions day to day.
Mm-hmm.
Another piece of framing I put in there is start with small experiments in low risk places
Right.
and make your experiments time bound. So you're at your local coffee shop. They ask you for your name. So when they call up your order, and if they have paper cups still, they write the wrong name.
Yeah.
Do you say something when they call you Ellen,
Mm.
when I'm Elaine? So many of us are like, it's not worth my time. It
Yes.
doesn't really
Yeah.
matter. I won't
Yeah.
see the barista again. But that to me is one of those really low stakes contexts to say, actually, it's Elaine,
Yeah.
right? And to feel that in your body. And what you're trying to do is actually get data points that tell you the world doesn't fall apart. No one's going to destroy you
Mm-hmm.
if you make that correction or you offer your opinion. Because for those of us for whom it is hard to speak up, it is because there's been a lifetime of other data that
Yeah.
says it's not okay, it's not
Yes.
safe. So
Yeah.
I'd start there. And
Mm-hmm.
the coffee shop to me is a low risk environment. And by the way, if you have a horrifying experience, go to a different coffee shop,
Yeah,
right? If you live in
exactly.
a place where you've got multiple options. So that calculation of what is really low risk, or I often will start with, the friends and family situations. What are we having for dinner tonight? All right, you're talking about pasta. What if we have tacos?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Look for the contexts that feel really low stakes, because at the end of the day, if they still want pasta, all right, let's have pasta.
Sure. But you're
But
willing to put yourself out for the conversation, for your opinion
you're,
to count or
you're
something.
trying it on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And obviously, there's a lot more in the book, but a couple places I'd start. In the book, I offer four anchors because it's not a linear process. But
Mm.
one of the anchors is start with why. And this is certainly Simon Sinek work around start with why, but there's got to be a reason why it matters for you to use your voice. And if you can anchor to the bigger why, then you've got something to go back to when the waves get big, because they often do. If people are not used to you having a different opinion,
Right.
if you are not used to taking up space, it's going to feel awkward. They might have a reaction. But the other anchor I offer is embrace resistance. A, to know and expect that it's going to happen so that when someone else's defensiveness shows up, you're like, oh, there it is.
Yeah.
I knew it was coming, rather than being caught off guard. And then if we look at research around the voice cultivation process, resistance is actually a key piece of it, meaning you may not like the way that they are engaging, but they're actually engaging.
Yeah.
And that is data for you, right? This is the mindset that salespeople often take, which is even if it's not a yes, the fact that you got any engagement
That's right.
is great, right? So
Yeah.
how do you work with that? How do you unpack that? But to not be thrown off guard or discouraged because they disagree, that's actually part of the process.
Mm.
The other two anchors are connect the dots, meaning this is Chris Argyris' ladder of inference. We may have different data sets. We may think about it differently. At some level, I really dislike this advice because I'm like, I just want people to read my mind,
Don't
right?
we
Why
all?
do I have to go through the
Yeah.
labor of explaining this to you?
Yeah.
But we each filter information and have access to different information. So can we connect the dots as we see them to then see where the disconnects are? And the fourth anchor is make your ask clear.
Mm.
Meaning, what are you actually asking of them? Are you asking the barista to change your name? Are you asking them to remake your order?
Mm.
What is it paired with your why? But to me, those small experiments with the mindset of it's an ongoing process gets us going. And of course, the four anchors allow us to have something to hang on to in the inevitable turmoil that can feel present.
Yeah.
So that's where I'd start in terms of unlearning our own silence and unlearning the ways that we silence other people. I'd actually start with a fundamental layer again, which is to say, if you are human, you silence other people, not because you're bad, not because you're not a good person, right? All of these identity things that can get us really defensive. I have silenced people. Let me own that. And instead of staying in the guilt, let me get to the action, which is in my next moment, in my next meeting, in my next day, I have the opportunity to make different choices.
Yeah.
So, how do I choose that? It starts with awareness and it requires action. So, of course, in the book, I talk about 9 different ways that we unintentionally silence people.
That's a
Let
lot
me
of
start with
ways.
it's a lot of ways, but hopefully it
Unfortunately.
also
Yeah.
gives us a checklist to say which of these might I be doing.
Right.
And a lot of them are really subtle. So I'll offer two if we've got time here.
Yes, absolutely.
One is fundamentally underestimating the challenge.
Mm.
So often we hear leaders say, just speak up. And this was part of the impetus of the book, right? Leaders who say, just speak up. I want to hear what you have to say.
Yes.
And for those of us who have been silenced, our internal voice is like, there's no effing way I can do that.
No, there's too much risk.
There's too much risk that you don't realize because you're not me, you're not in my situation, because you are differently positioned, all of those things. But for leaders to just have the awareness that other people really wrestled with whether to ask about hot French fries.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because if that's not your lived experience, and for many white, cis, able bodied men, that is not your experience because your voice has always been welcome.
Hmm.
But for you to say, just speak up, really doesn't take into account everything else that
It,
so many people live. And so your advice falls flat, even though it's well intentioned.
yeah. I've been in these
And
conversations too, even as a white person,
mhm,
with other, powerful men who
yes,
say to me, you're bright enough to be in any room. Why aren't you speaking up? Why can't you just share your ideas? And they don't understand the barriers or uh, they don't see the stories of, well, I've been fired for speaking up about sexual harassment. Like,
Mhm.
these are scary rooms to be in.
Mhm.
Things like that that are part of the backstory that is just wholly missing from that interaction. Um,
Completely.
yeah. And so there's so much power in just stopping and trying to imagine somebody else's situation with empathy. There's
Mhm.
a That's so challenging too, right? To ask somebody to just mind read or to understand the perspective or the experience of somebody else without having been told.
Mm.
So I'm
Mhm.
kind of like aware of that, right?
Yeah.
There's a deep challenge there for leaders too, to tread lightly and carefully, right?
I don't know if it's tread lightly or carefully so much as to move forward with awareness.
Mm,
And part of the reason of writing a book really is a labor of love, but also wanting a resource.
mm,
Because if you're going to someone on your team and saying, "Hey, Dominique, tell me about how hard it is for you to speak up," right? Like that,
yeah.
that is labor and risk inherently. And so part of my hope is that the book is a conversation starter to
Yes.
raise awareness to say this actually happens. And I don't want your direct reports to have to do the emotional and relational labor of educating you because that's your work to do.
Yeah.
So how do we raise awareness to that very different lived experience? And one, to me, simple way of remedying that dynamic is to actually design our communication flows rather than let them fall to default. Because
Mm,
what happens if we're not actively designing our communication flows is that they default to the preferences and norms of the dominant groups or the people who have the most organizational and relational power. So you think about global organizations. Everybody comes to headquarters.
yeah.
We value the CEO's time higher than anyone else's and pay them more. So then we're doing the key meetings in their prime time hours, which also means that if I'm in India or in Singapore, I'm up at 4 in the morning or 1 a.m.,
Oh, yeah.
which we've all done. And you cannot expect someone to be firing on all cylinders at that time of day. And I don't care what fancy term you come up with it, people call it time shifting.
Yeah.
Your body clock and the disruption, you are inherently silencing someone or inclining someone towards silence if you're not playing to their dominant communication style. And yet in organizations, we say to be an executive or to have executive presence means to communicate in 3 succinct bullet points without any ums. So,
Yeah.
what do we do with people who are wired differently? And the thing that to me is so damaging is as we're in these workplaces that prioritize one mode, one medium, and elevate that way of communicating, the message that we send to everyone else is your wiring is weakness.
Mm,
Right? If you are not someone who processes real time or communicates in this way, then there's something wrong with you. Maybe we'll get you some coaching if we really value you and want to invest in you, but change yourself. Whether it is neurodiversity, whether it is just differences of how we're created as human beings, those differences of how we process, how we communicate, there are differences in wiring rather than weakness.
mhm,
So, can we even look at our teams and just say, if we really want to hear people's perspectives, A, is there a clear way and a clear avenue through which they can communicate, right? If you have a thought, put it in Slack. If you leave after the meeting and the idea comes up, do you email, do you text, do you phone, do you spend so much time analyzing how do I get through to someone versus this is what you should do, let's make the avenue clear and
right.
let's actually optimize the avenues for voice, meaning for Dominique, is it easier for you to communicate by writing and typing or by verbalizing or something else entirely?
Interpretive dance. I'm
Great.
kidding, but
No, I don't. I mean, this if we really want people's best ideas and insights, why wouldn't we, purely from a self-interested perspective, make it as easy as possible, reduce the barriers to communicating and bringing those forward?
yes, yeah.
Otherwise, we're playing into the Babel hypothesis of leadership that says the person who talks the most and the loudest has the best ideas, which we know just isn't true
No, that's amazing that that still works, though, doesn't it?
because it is so baked into how we operate.
Yeah.
And that's where that difference between reactive and reflective decision making matters. What are we really trying to do here? And for those of us who care about humanity, it's actually an option that honors human dignity more than making everyone conform to a certain norm or style. But as a leader, have you had the conversation with the people on your team to say, hey, what makes it easiest for you to communicate? Do you prefer to type, text, or talk?
Right.
And let me tell you my preferences because it's not, well, let's be clear, let's use our frameworks from earlier. Is this going to be something that you as the leader decide? Is this something that you're going to jointly decide? But to me, the power of making it discussable, which by the way is like a 30-second conversation that can save so much time and energy and get the best insights out,
Mm.
it's actually just a good investment of time. If you haven't said that, the conversation can sound something like, and you could play to your own strengths of saying it or typing it. We've worked together for about 3 years, but I realize I've never asked you this.
Mm.
What makes it easiest for you? Because I, if you do, value your thoughts and opinions and want to make this as easy as possible for you to bring forth your best thinking and
What
see what
is
they say.
another simple and such a powerful idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
Simple and powerful. It's not a very heavy lift. It's
Mm.
not time or resource intensive. These
No.
are small tweaks that you're recommending, and I can just see how different organizations would be if leaders took the time to do these very
Mm-hmm.
tiny things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Is there another way that you wanted to share that leaders should unlearn silence or unlearn the silencing of others?
Yeah. I'm thinking about highest value add here because it seems like such an opportunity. I'll go to one that is really subtle, but also happens so unconsciously, which is how often leaders change the subject to themselves, change the subject period of a conversation, and particularly specifically change the topic back to themselves. So someone says, we've got an issue with procurement. We're not going to hit the deadline. And the leader, instead of saying, wow, I hear that, tell me more, or how can I support you, says, that's not going to work, just make it happen. Right? We experience it as defensiveness. We experience it as being shut down. We experience it as I said something, I did the right thing in giving you a status update, and I got shot down. And a lot of times that leader's response comes from pressure that comes from above,
Yeah.
around, and certainly in this environment where everyone is brittle and burnt out and tired, it is reactive. But as a leader, the ripple effect of your behaviors is to shape the culture around you because that one response in that moment becomes the data point in which the conclusion is this is not a culture where you can actually tell the leader what's going on. So notice in that moment, are you focusing on the topic that they originally raised, which is the delay with procurement? Or are you changing the topic to what needs to happen or what pressures you're under or your own perspective? There are a bunch of different terms from this. Sheila Heen and Doug Stone call this switch tracking. Robert Livingston calls it channel surfing, but it's that really subtle shift from what the person's topic was to a
Yeah.
different topic.
Yeah. And
And
again, just like I feel like that level of concentration on the person and their
mhm,
communication to you is a split second. Like, I mean, we're talking about just one quick sentence to say, like, did I hear you right? Or tell me more, or whatever it is that your little catchphrase happens to
yeah,
be, right? Yeah.
yes. And I will say, when I say the book talks about 9 different ways that we as leaders silence people, I can imagine some people thinking, oh my God, I just can't do it. It's too much, right? I'm never going to get it right.
Yeah.
But this conversation is reminding me what I hope comes through, which is take one of these micro skills
Hmm.
and focus on it for 1 week because it does become second nature or habit over time when you unlearn the habit that you have and practice something else. That the whole purpose of leaders unlearning the way they silence other people, that we silence other people, is to bring us more in alignment with how we see ourselves, align the good intentions we have with the impact we're actually having. And I don't know a leader who says, I want to go and, silence my people. That's not the narrative
No. Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
So, how do we bring your actions and how you show up in alignment with the vision that you have for your leadership, which takes intentionality and breaking it down into these micro pieces?
It's powerful stuff. And I love how bite-sized these actions are.
Mm.
And, it takes commitment on the overall. It reminds me a lot of parenting, to be honest, right?
Say
This
more.
where you have to just pick one and
Yes,
practice.
yes.
And you know that your goal is connection. You know that your goal
Mm.
is for this little person to be heard and to create this environment of safety and nurturance. And you can't always get it right, but if you don't, if you mess up, you go back and you try
Mhm.
again. And
Mhm.
that's a powerful thing too, is just the admission that
Yes.
you haven't always been perfect or that you are attempting something, and to ask for accountability, to ask someone to keep you accountable and to let you know if you've done the right thing and if they felt heard.
Mhm.
But it does take this constant, putting yourself in there, and then you grow, and
Yep.
things that things that were unnatural to begin with become sort of just your way of being and doing things.
So, Dominique, you're saying there is hope that my
There
6 year
is.
old will put his dirty socks in the laundry hamper.
Yes. When
Okay.
they are 18, maybe. Yeah.
This is why we're playing the long game.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I just got my kids to do it with points. So I'm feeling pretty good about myself these days.
Congrats. I
Yeah.
love it.
So I want to take a tiny bit more of your time and allow you to dream a little bit and to share what your utopian vision is. If
Mm,
people took all of this advice to heart and we were all able to collectively speak up and had leaders who unlearned silencing, what do you think the changes would be at the organizational level? And you can answer this by relying on positive examples that you've seen or
mhm,
use your imagination. But what is it that you're trying to achieve with all of this unsilencing?
mhm. It's two levels, much as the way that we've been analyzing how we're unlearning the ways we silence ourselves and also the ways that we silence each other. On the individual level, it's that we feel seen, known, and heard,
Mm,
that we're not moving through the world having to tiptoe or walk as if we're on eggshells, but we can channel that energy that we spend having to silence and contort ourselves to other efforts. I want us as human beings to be more whole and to be able to do that in our families, in our workplaces, in our communities. At a social level, I think what it gets us to is that belonging, dignity, and justice are true for every human being, not just for a privileged few. And that unleashes new ideas. That unleashes a sense of community, of being in it together, rather than being positioned against each other. That there is room for difference, and that difference is useful
mm.
to figure out this world that can feel so messy and gnarly, figure out a way forward.
That's quite the vision.
I hope it's not just utopia, but that it
Me
becomes
neither. Yeah.
reality,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
In whatever sphere of influence, whether that is your family, whether that is your work team of 3 or of 13 or of 30 or 3,000. But it starts with each of us in our own spheres of influence.
Absolutely. What a powerful message. Thank you for sharing your utopian vision with
Mm.
me. I think that it's really important to take time to articulate these things and to kind of find that goal again, to let ourselves believe that it is possible,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
and that these tools that we are all developing together are kind of put to the service of a specific goal, and what that
Mhm.
goal is can be shared, and it's a powerful thing. It's a really
Mhm.
powerful driving force. As we close out, I want you to please tell our listeners about your book. When and where can we get it?
Mhm.
I honestly feel like this is a fantastic book to share with anyone, both,
Mhm.
folks who have been silenced and others, especially leaders, obviously, who might be able to create opportunities for the voices of others. So it has, this beautiful, universal and broad appeal.
Mhm.
And your messaging is so concise. So I really look forward to getting my hands on it and sharing it with others too. So do tell us when and where we can get it.
Sure. The book is Unlearning Silence: How to Speak Your Mind, Unleash Talent, and Live More Fully. And in the UK version is Lead with Courage instead of Live More Fully. And there's a whole story behind that. But the book will launch into the world March 19th, 2024. You can pre-order wherever books are sold.
Amazing. I really look forward to that launch date, and I will keep tuned because that's an exciting day, and it'll be an exciting day for you, I'm sure, most of all.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I have a bonus question in the spirit of speaking up and
Love
having our voices heard and raising up silenced voices. Is there anyone whose work or message you'd like to amplify today?
If you're asking a bonus question, I'm going to give you bonus answers.
Awesome.
Multiple. So, first is Keisha Winter, who wrote a fantastic piece on low power language. There's so much commentary about being more direct, and Keisha's analysis that low power language is strategic, particularly for people with subordinate identities, is very much worth the read. Again, in the vein of being careful about what advice you offer, right? Be more direct, be more confident, be more courageous has its limitations and should be informed by our lived experiences. My bonus person and content would be Dr. Janice Gassam, who wrote a book called Decentering Whiteness in the Workplace that really just blew my mind. I think we're swimming in these work environments that were created by so much more than ourselves. And the analysis that so much of our workplaces centers whiteness is really important to factor in. So I'll
Mm.
leave you with Keisha Winter and Dr. Janice Gassam.
Amazing. Yeah, both excellent resources for anyone who wants to dive deeper into this topic. So thank you so much for sharing your message with us today. If you want to stay connected with Elaine Lin Hering, the links to her socials are in the show notes. And as always, I welcome any of our listeners to reach out to me if you'd like to be a featured guest on this podcast, or if you want to sneakily nominate someone else. My email is always in the show notes too. If you like what you're hearing, please leave us a rating and a review, or share the episode to your own socials. It really does help get this podcast and today Elaine's message into more ears. Elaine, thank you so very much for joining us today on Just One Q.
Thanks so much for having me. Be well.
You too. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm
Mm.
Dominique Atrell. Thank you for listening, and see you next time on Just One Q.